I do have some questions I'd like to ask, and I'll start again with my my colleague from the Rules Committee, who's also on the Appropriations Committee. Mr. Cole, those who have concerns with biennial budgeting, and that has been talked about today, I think should identify other potential improvements to the process. But you're so intimately aware of the existing process. Would you make some other suggestions on ways to improve the appropriations process? Again, I think the issue that was brought up today about doing something about the bills that are on automatic, or the spending that's on automatic pilot. But would you make some other suggestions?
They'd be very technical, and really, I think around the edges. I'd like to see all the amendments pre-printed, and so that we know what's coming. I think that makes it easier to estimate the amount of time. I think it minimizes the tendency to do got you amendments, although I think they're going to happen. I mean, members have to have the courage to vote up or down on things, and if you want to bring something to the floor under an open rule, then the other side or people with a different point of view on your own side are going to have the opportunity to ask difficult votes on amendments. That's fine, but you have to have the courage to do it. Second, this is just me, but I would never allow a continuing resolution. I would get rid of that. That is the big abdication of responsibility. And I will tell you, 3 years ago, when we operated by a continuing resolution, and as my friend pointed out, there was a big difference between an omnibus and a continuing resolution. I mean, an omnibus, those bills have at least all gone through committee, have all been subject to amendment or negotiated. It's not an automatic pilot sort of thing. But, a number of years ago when we did that, and I say this with no particular animus toward anybody, but the Appropriations Committee wasn't even consulted. That was a leadership decision to do a continuing resolutions without talking to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. They had no idea what they had given up. They had no earthly idea how much power they had ceded to the executive branch. The only thing they were in control of was a top-line number. So if you want to make people do the job, make them do the job. Don't give them an easy way out. And I would mandate, and again, this is just, that those bills, as soon as they're marked up in committee, that they move to the floor immediately. And there's no sense holding them around, because there's going to be, let's get them to the floor and find out whether or not. Last point I would make is, and I'm not exactly sure the mechanism, but we've got to sit down and decide this whole issue of riders and what's appropriate and what's not. Again, it's appropriate to me if we're talking about managing money inside of an agency. If we're attaching lots of other things to them or limiting that agency, that's fine. But we go into other areas where, again, if you can't move it across the floor in a straight-up bill out of an authorizing committee, why in the world do you think we're going to be able to get it through an appropriations committee? Sometimes we can, but this leads to much more dysfunction than it does to actually reaching a policy objective. So I would recommend that we sit down and study those. But those are just, again, at the end of the day, I think you hit it precisely in your testimony. This is a question of political will and political courage. This is also a question of going into areas that are, quote, the third rail and all the entitlement and all the tax areas and having the courage to vote. The appropriations process will, insofar as it is dysfunctional, is largely dysfunctional because we have problems, I would argue, in other areas. The committee actually does its work pretty well when it's allowed to do its work.
Well, I want to say to you that, and I should have said this at the beginning, that I do compliment the Appropriations Committee for having done its work last year and getting every bill out. And I agree with you. It's unfortunate that we were not able to get votes on all of that legislation. So I want to compliment all of you for doing that. And I want to say to my colleagues, I know that Mr. Ribble has pointed out that there is bipartisan support for this legislation, but there's also bipartisan opposition to this legislation. And I very much appreciate Dr. Price's comments today, and particularly our colleague, Mr. Hastings. I think he and I find ourselves sort of in the same place, and I always think it's important that we highlight that because people think we always disagree on everything, and I think it's important. Mr. McClintock, you talked a little bit about your concerns, and you're always so articulate. I always learn from you when you speak. But we've talked a lot about the Congress's role in the budget process. But I think we agree that the president is a major impediment to this process as well. And I think the comprehensive reforms your committee's undertaking are vital. Would you give a little more of your thoughts on how we can ensure the president and executive branch give back some of the power to Congress and make constructive contributions to the process?
Again, the term regular order is thrown around here a lot. I hope it doesn't lose its meaning because it refers to a process that's evolved. It was established in the Constitution. It's evolved over 2 centuries of practice to be a pretty good way to resolve differences among very diverse opinions and to separate the powers of government in a manner that preserves our liberty. The president's role in the budget as the chief executive officer of the country's government, I should say, is to estimate what does he think it's going to take to faithfully execute the laws that he is responsible for administering. Once he's done that, the president has no role in the process. From then on, it is the sole prerogative of the representatives of the people to decide how much money we will give him to run the government. He then enters the process at the very end by deciding whether to sign or veto that legislation. I think we short-circuit that separation of powers when we hold behind closed-door meetings between legislative leaders and the president. Certainly there's going to be a constant stream of discussions going back and forth, but Congress needs to restore its role in the most important function it serves, and that is to appropriate the monies necessary to run